Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Eric Arauz.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having me in this panel today. My name is Eric Arauz. I'm the president of the Trauma Institute in New Jersey, and I'm also an adjunct faculty instructor at the Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. Before we start moving into what today's panel is about, I'd like to just frame what it's going to look like. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Heather Forkey. Dr. Heather Forkey is the Clinical Director of Foster Care Evaluation Services at UMass Memorial and a Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. She's going to show about a 10 to 12-minute slide presentation. What that's going to introduce you to is what this story looks like when a child is incubated in terror. If the narration of the day is the prisoner's story, we're going to start from the very beginning of these atrocities that start setting place neurophysiologically and lead to the behaviors that we see. If we accomplish anything today, we're going to get rid of the word bad. And all we're going to see are the adaptations that anybody would make in that exact same situation. If that occurs today, then the energy and passion of this movement will take place. Because when Chris mentioned about the talent behind bars, if you were born into this, if you had to see your mother suffer, your friends die, your talent will get locked behind the invisible bars of a body you don't even understand anymore. The next speaker will be a Dr. Tracey Shores from Rutgers University. She's a behavioral neuroscientist and a professor at Rutgers University, and I know a lot of your research work has been in the neurogenesis of the hippocampus and learning and memory. We will then move on to Reverend Gloria Walton, who's the executive director of the Most Excellent Way of Life Center in Jersey City, and who has over 30 years working with children in the division. Everyone's fantastic, but I like to say this anytime I see Miss Muhammad. She will be the next speaker, and everybody's going to get about 5 minutes to start taking this story from the biology to the behavior. From that, you'll go to incarceration in the next panel, and lastly, we'll look at these programs that can be done and that are being done currently in Jersey City. And then we'll have Frank Mazza, who's the director of Reentry, and he'll tie it all together, and then we'll move through. I just want to give two statistics before I bring up Dr. Forkey. One is, 1 in 6 state male inmates reported being physically or sexually abused before the age of 18. Over 56% experienced childhood physical trauma. 56%. So when I took my daughter today for pictures and we were doing her hair in East Brunswick, and I have little Buddhas in my front lawn, and I have little Easter bunnies, it's a very confused house. I never stop hearing the calls of the children walking through the streets of Newark that deserve the same attention and care and parental attunement that my daughter's currently getting. And the last thing I'll say before we bring up Dr. Forkey is a few months ago, as I was having dinner with the governor and Tom Calcagni, and we were kidding around outside, and you had said, Eric, how do we even get better outcomes? How do we fix this? And I said, I know how. And you and Tom may or may not have made fun of me for a few minutes. And then I said, you need to address the trauma. You have to address the somatic issues that are causing many of these platforms that take away the term evil, and now we can add the word wounded. So thank you very much, as you always do, Governor, in executing a vision, bringing people together, and at least starting a race that now it's up for us to finish. I'd like to bring up the first speaker, Dr. Heather Forkey.
Thank you all so much. I'm so honored to be a part of this project or this day. My other job at UMass is to run the child protection program, where we evaluate kids who've been abused or neglected, both physically and sexually. In fact, as I was sitting listening to the first speakers, I did get a text from my office asking me about a little girl who looks a lot like this one, because they needed my advice. She had just been pulled out of a home where mom has drug and mental health issues. Her most recent boyfriend is a level 3 sex offender. And in addition to that, she's been witnessing domestic violence. So there were a host of questions that were coming to me while I was waiting. Her exposures are not unlike many of the kids that we take care of in terms of being exposed to physical abuse, parental drug use, issues of poverty, issues of witnessing domestic violence, and issues of homelessness. And as kids age, these adversities mount, and eventually delinquency and death of their friends are a big part of their lives as well. So I've already used a number of terms: adversities, trauma. You'll hear toxic stress. What are we talking about when we say trauma, all these terms? Because most of us were raised in a setting where the only thing we knew about trauma was really what we heard about in terms of acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. Those were definitions that came about through diagnoses based on the experiences of young adult males who had experienced one particular type of trauma, that of wartime. But the truth is that children are not little adults, and their exposures are different than those that soldiers experience in wartime. In fact, what we know now is that the traumas that impact children the most significantly are ones that usually happen in the home and among their caregivers. So things like emotional abuse, loss, impaired caregivers, domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect. And while some kids are certainly exposed to war and terrorism, those other exposures are the ones that become the more significant. So we in pediatrics have begun to talk about this in terms of toxic stress. So every child is exposed to some stressors, and most of them are positive. In fact, we have to have some kind of stress so that we can grow and can learn. So if a child has a big test or a baseball game, those are actually positive stressors. There are some other stressors that kids experience, which we would call moderate stressors or tolerable stressors, things like the death of a grandparent or a house fire, which could be destructive to that child, but are usually happening in the context of a supporting, loving family who can help that child get through it. And when we're talking about toxic stressors, we're talking about things like parental drug abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse. These are things that are actually impacting the architecture of brains of young children. And while we can move these stressors along the continuum with some supports, we may be able to take some of these toxic stressors and make them less harmful. There's also kids for whom some of the less traumatic stressors become more traumatic because of the situation that those kids are in. And part of this, and why it makes so much sense once you understand that children are actually born well before they're fully ready to be born. In fact, when I was in medical school, one of my professors told me that kids come out about 3/4 of the way baked. But you have to get them out because the pelvis can't support a head that would be completely developed. So once a child is born, the brain is going through a huge amount of development in those first few years. We're taking the cells and we're moving them to where they belong. We're having those cells make connections with each other. And these are all the fancy words for those connections that are being made, the synapses that are forming. And eventually, those brain connections get pruned down by a process called apoptosis, where we prune out what we don't need and we keep what we do need. And then we myelinate it, so those functions can go quicker and quicker and quicker. So if you look at what the brain neuron density looks like over time, you start off with these cells sort of sparsely all over the brain, and we make all these connections. I don't have to point out to you guys that you guys are already decaying and that your brain is really on the slippery slope back the other way. But by 2 and 3, we've really made a lot of these connections. We've started to myelinate them so that the ability to function becomes automatic. And the way that that happens is that you're born with the genetic potential, but that development actually happens based on the environment that you're in. So if genes are the gun, environment is the trigger, and nothing happens without it being presented to you in your environment. So if I want a child to learn to walk, I have to help that child to take a few steps. I have to hold them up. I have to get them to move. And kids who are left in a car seat all day and never get the opportunity to come to my office all the time unable to walk or crawl because they just haven't had the opportunity. If I want my child to learn to play the piano, they have to keep practicing. And if they practice again and again, those connections will be made in the brain, and eventually they'll be able to play the song without even trying. We know now that if I want a child to learn language, I have to speak more and more words to them. And if the situation that that child is in is one that no one's talking, or there's depression and a parent can't express themselves to that child, that they will not learn language. So if I want that child to have all these positive things happen, I have to expose that child to that capability again and again. If what that child is exposed to is danger and fear, that's what the brain will learn. That's what the brain gets used to handling. And bravo, because the brain is designed to help us live within the environment that we're in. And so for better or for worse, whatever that environment is, that is what is shaping our child's brain. Now bear with me, I'm going to use some scientific stuff for a few minutes, but I think it's worthwhile. So when you have fear, it stimulates a part of your body called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And what that means is that the brain sends a signal to the rest of your body to get ready, because we've got some kind of danger coming right at us. And we have to be able to run or fight or hide, but some ability to get away from that danger. As soon as those signals come out, they're actually feeding back to the brain to say, okay, shut the system down, because we're going to have enough for what we need. And that is fantastic, because our bodies were designed for us to live in the wilderness. And we were supposed to be able to run away from the tiger. And those hormones sending those signals to our body would help us fight the tiger or run away. But it was designed to last for 20 minutes, because in 20 minutes we either did run away, or we did hide, or the tiger ate us. But in 20 minutes it was over. The problem for the kids now is that the tiger lives in their home or their neighborhood or their life. And so what that looks like is that that stress is coming to their brain again and again and again. And the very systems which are supposed to be shutting down are being overridden by the threat that comes at them again and again and again. It is having impacts turning on that cortisol so that it's screaming in their system. It also is impacting their immune system. It's saying, turn up everything that you need to be able to fight a bite. Turn down anything that would help you fight infection, because you know what? We're not expecting to be attacked by the flu. We're being expected to be attacked by an animal. And then we actually find now that that cortisol in such high quantities in the body is going to start to change our genes. And we're going to change at the very gene level how sensitive we are to these trauma hormones. So what does that mean then in the brain? There are some parts of the brain that are being very significantly affected. One is the amygdala. And the amygdala you can think about as the brain's emotional memory system or the brain's alarm system. If that cortisol is pumping up, that alarm system is being turned on and turned on and turned on. And so over time, the amygdala gets very, very big in these kids. The other thing is the hippocampus, which you can think about as it has a big role in memory and learning. It helps you kind of take information and get it from the top of the brain down to the bottom of the brain. It's like the brain's file cabinet or search engine. And Dr. Shores is going to talk more about this, and I am embarrassed to even mention it because this is her area. But what happens to the hippocampus is that it actually gets smaller and smaller, because you don't want to be, in times of threat, thinking, I got to get some more information about this tiger. Would it be African or Asian? No, no, no. We just have to run. The other part of the brain that's being affected is the frontal cortex, and this is the part of the brain that's responsible for executive function. And what executive function is a combination of impulse control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. It's the frontal cortex which helps us sit in a classroom and shut down our impulse to kind of wander away. It helps us to take what we learned yesterday and apply it to today. And it helps us to take the concepts and integrate them so that we can keep building on what we learned before. But if you think about the brain of a child who lives with trauma, that alarm is going off all the time. Their ability to access information from the brain is shut down, as is their ability to have any executive function. So what does toxic stress look like in a child? It doesn't actually look like what a soldier looks like. It looks like a child with a vacant look in her eye. It looks like the toddler who's been kicked out of preschool for the 3rd time. And ultimately, it looks like the teenager who's starting on the path to juvenile detention. This is kind of a complex chart, but it's one I use with physicians to help them understand that even if we think about just one part of the brain, that frontal cortex, and we look at how that is being impacted and what it will look like to us, is that we may very well be misinterpreting that child's behaviors, which are actually trauma-related, as something that maybe looks to us like attention deficit disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. But in fact, this is a brain that is perfectly now ready to deal with threat. And what we are doing the wrong thing. We are misinterpreting what this child is doing because we're not looking at it in the context that that child comes from. Because if the threat is at home and they show up in the classroom and they have no impulse control, so they're not able to focus on the teacher, and they have impacts on their cognitive flexibility, so they can't pick up facts, well, that child is sent in to me as a pediatrician for me to give him ADHD medications. And when that child is a teenager and they start to try to work at McDonald's and they can't listen at the same time as they're trying to do something else because their executive function is thrown off, and then somebody says to him, well, what did you do? And he makes up an answer because you're demanding something from him, but he can't keep the facts in his head. Well, then I say he has an integrity issue. And when his impulse control becomes a problem because he's ready to fight and he knows that he's under threat all the time, and when someone looks at him just a little bit off, the principal keeps saying to him, you just keep looking for a fight. Now that kid is one who's starting down the juvenile detention pathway. So it is very profound for me to work with the kids that I see and be able to say to them, you know, all that this is happening, this is your body doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It's not your fault. It's your body working magnificently, absolutely the way it was designed to work. It's we that are misinterpreting it. For instance, if I went hiking and I saw a snake on the ground, I would freeze or I would scream or I would have a very strong reaction. If I went hiking again 2 weeks later and I came around the corner and there were some roots on the ground, I would probably scream or freeze or do something again. And one of my kids would look at me and go, Mom, what is your problem? Well, you know what? I'm reacting to something that happened to me before, but you just weren't there. You don't know that that's what I'm reacting to. And if we don't identify this in medicine and in the areas that you guys are working for our kids, and they don't get treated in sort of a primary care fashion, we have plenty of tertiary care to take these kids to. We give them diagnoses like oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder and bipolar disorder, and we put them in institutions. And when those don't work, we have another institution to take them to too as well. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues.
You always got to get warmed up at one of the governor's events. And so when I first talked to Dr. Forkey, and after about 2 minutes, we're chatting, and I was like, wow, even the doctor has soul. Like, you start realizing what you're doing, and you start realizing, as Dr. Shores will now come up and discuss, she has the science background, but she has an unbelievable intervention as well, involving, is it homeless mothers? Or homeless mothers and mindfulness, all based in science, everybody working to create this paradigm to bring this science to light in real activities. I'd like to introduce Dr. Shores.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric, Governor McGreevy, and everyone. It's really an honor to be here. Today's theme is the prisoner's story, and as such, I thought it might be useful, or at least I would use my time to discuss briefly how the brain creates and maintains our own personal narratives. The story of our lives seems seamless. We go from the present to the past and back to the present and into the future. However, life itself only occurs in this moment, and therefore the brain is really good at creating our life story. I study a part of the brain known as the hippocampus, and the hippocampus contributes considerably to this process of story making. I like to think of the hippocampus as a learning machine. It is used to learn and encode memories about who we are, these so-called autobiographical memories. Now, up until quite recently, we didn't fully appreciate how much the brain can change. And specifically, we thought that the brain didn't make any new neurons. And neurons are like the principal cells of the brain that are used to communicate information. But more recently, we found that we were wrong. Scientists are oftentimes wrong. And that the brain really does make new neurons throughout the lifespan. In fact, thousands of new neurons are being made in your brain every day. So presumably, some are being made right now. It turns out that most of these new neurons are made in the hippocampus, the part of the brain that's responsible or contributes significantly to creating the story of your life, the story that goes from the past to the present and into the future. So therefore, these neurons are really in a perfect place to change the story of your life. I've been working with a group of women, who Eric just mentioned, who were found homeless on the streets of New Jersey with their children. They now live in a residential treatment center known as the Center for Great Expectations in Somerset. And there they receive treatment for addictions, trauma, and mental illness. Most of these women have spent time in jail or prison or had some kind of run-in with the law. In fact, the other day, I heard a few of them talking about what prison, if they go back to prison, they should try to get into prison X because you can smoke there. So not only have they been maybe in prison, but they're even imagining themselves going back to prison in the future. And almost all of these women have experienced severe trauma as children and as young women. So the other day, I heard one of the women answer the phone, and she said, "Hi, this is Christy, the girl who was raped by her stepfather." So I was quite taken aback to realize that that was her identity. That's how she defines herself, the girl who was raped by her stepfather. And that she was tied so tightly to this experience that she'd had as a child. So we know that traumatic life events have devastating effects on the brain, as we just heard, especially if they occur in childhood. And we do know a little bit about how this might occur. So for example, we know that these new neurons, fewer of these new neurons are made after response to a stressful event. And my lab recently showed that exposure to sexual aggression during puberty causes fewer of these cells to survive in females. And we also know that fewer of these cells are made in response to alcohol and drugs of abuse. So these cells are very responsive to our environment and the negative things that happen to us. But the good news is that they also respond to positive behaviors, healthy behaviors. For example, we know that aerobic exercise greatly increases the number of neurons that are made in your brain. And perhaps more importantly, we know that you can keep these cells alive by learning something new. So based on these studies and other studies around the world, we decided to create an intervention that would kind of capitalize on this change in the brain and really maximize its potential. This intervention is known as MAP training because it combines mental and physical training. The subjects participate in 30 minutes of meditation training. And in this meditation process, we try to get the subjects to appreciate the fact that the past doesn't exist anymore, and to not attach, at least emotionally, to those negative experiences. It's hard to do because the past seems real. Like when we think about what happened, even earlier today, it seems real. But it isn't. It's just a representation now in our brain. So it takes practice to really fully understand that process or that fact. After the meditation training, we have them engage in 30 minutes of pretty high-intensity aerobic exercise. And in the women, we also have them learn dance routines, similar to the popular Zumba dance routine, because women love to dance, as we know. So we've been providing this intervention to several populations of people who have had severe trauma in their lives, including these young women who were homeless on the streets of New Jersey. And we've documented many positive effects. They're less depressed, they're less anxious, they're more mindful, and perhaps most importantly, they're less likely to ruminate about the past. They're also physically more healthy, and the neurons in their brain are responding more vigorously as they make important decisions. Some of the most exciting changes that I have seen are rather anecdotal. For example, one of the women told me the other day that she'd never thought about a thought before. She said, well, I thought thoughts were real. Like, I have a thought and I do something. I never thought that they weren't real, that I don't have to act on every thought that occurs to me. Another woman told me, she said, oh, finally I get it. I'm not a drug addict. I used to use drugs in the past, but I'm not a drug addict now. So clearly, she had learned to distinguish the present from the past, and she was creating a new story about herself. So even though trauma during childhood can have detrimental effects on the brain, we also know that our brain has an amazing capacity to change as long as we continue to learn. Thank you.
As we sit there and now move from a discussion of the neurophysiology and the brain, one of the things you take from it is the idea of the neuroplasticity and that things are not set forever. And when you think about that in trauma, there's a discussion about post-traumatic growth. Or in a story, you would think of it as editing, that you are allowed to go back and chapter 1 doesn't determine chapter 2. And chapter 3 doesn't determine chapter 4. And our unique task here is to realize maybe the first 200 chapters are written, and we have to make someone believe and show them how they can change for chapter 201. So now we're going to start moving into discussions about what people have seen for children that have had these adverse childhood experiences, and also interventions that they see in the positive. So the next speaker we're going to bring up is the Reverend Gloria Walton, and a quote comes to mind about Gloria with Viktor Frankl, where he said, once he saw suffering, he could never turn his back on it again. And the Reverend Walton spent over 3 decades working with youth for the division, and then created her own nonprofit to sit there and continue her work, even though her official work was done. And maybe this is even the more important work. So it's an honor to have her here.
Someone said that wounded soldiers don't go to war. Wounded soldiers don't go to war. Hey, Val. Wounded soldiers don't go to war. My background was in child protection services, and I would probably spend all day talking about the type of investigations that I had to embark upon, but I'd like to just state this, that childhood trauma really presents a risk for adults to visit prison. Not every child that I investigated landed in prison or jail, but it does present risk. And moving from the 30 years of child protection services to the Most Excellent Way Life Center, what I've found is that I'm really dealing with the same population. I received I house both male and female. I don't even like the terminology of ex-offenders, but to be politically correct, ex-offenders. And I actually stay at the house with the females. And what I began to notice is that on a daily basis, I'm greeted by a little girl who has not yet learned how to navigate the wars of life. And that's why I say wounded soldiers don't go to war. And and I'll use one example. I received a young lady, and usually I'm referred to affectionately as Miss G. The women in the house, the men, and now the community, and my co-laborers, even in the ministry, now call me Miss G. But this particular woman, I couldn't get close to her. And eventually what she reminded me was that I removed her children. And I was kind of shocked because I'm pretty good with faces, but it gave me a perfect opportunity to revisit the life that I knew prior to her being placed in my facility. It gave me the opportunity to engage her in her childhood and to make, for the sake of time, what we really saw was generational issues. She raised her children the same way that her mother raised her. And her response was, well, I didn't know any different. No one taught me. This is what happened to me. And so when it occurred in my family, I responded the only way that I knew. And so now, at the Most Excellent Way, what we've begun to do is to help our women and men alike to begin to reframe, to rewrite in so many ways who they are. And the program is a faith-based program. And so what we begin to do is to get them to understand that you were not born bad, and that because the wars of life, because no one taught you how to put on your gear. No one goes to war unprotected. Even the Word of God says put on the helmet of salvation so that you can protect your mind. But as a 5, 6, 3, 2-year-old, even an infant, where they should be safe in their home is where the most traumatic experiences that our adults have experienced. And so here we are at the Most Excellent Way, beginning to allow and to create a safe place. That's the first place. That's the first attempt, is to get them to understand that this new home is a safe place. Because home, as you grew to know it, was not safe. You had to lock your doors so your dad, your grandfather, your uncle, your brothers did not intrude into your personal space. And so getting our women to peel the layers off so we can take them back only for a moment. We don't stay in the childhood stage because they do have to grow up. But by faith, we teach them, one, to accept God of your understanding. Because this is what recovery is. It's not just being recovered from substance abuse, because the substance is just the consequences of war. And so we teach them how to reframe their thinking, how to, one, be recovered to God of your understanding, unto self, and then unto the community. They leave jail, we put them out, and we're trying to get them, back with their children, but they're not ready. And my experience of seeing family reunification occur often too soon, because we've not yet taught that mother nor that father how to be reunified within themselves, how to reshape and to rewrite their own stories, so that when they are reunified with their children, it is not business as usual, that this generational issues of abuse and neglect can change. That now as an adult, you understand that I wasn't born this way. I'm not bad because mama, daddy, nor sister, brother, grandma, nor the neighbor, nor the babysitter, nor the teacher said that I was. Somebody please keep me on time. I'm a Baptist preacher, I think. And I want you to understand that I don't do this because I'm a minister, but I do this because God has ordained me to do so. This is my passion. I think my friend says time is up. Is that my time? Thank you.
That is not a speech you want to cut off in any way. So, but we are going to keep things moving. We have two more people to speak, and this is someone, I always want to make sure I get her first name right, because I always hear Miss Muhammad, but Miss Helena Muhammad is somebody you meet who really combines great passion and great energy and great efficacy. And when that happens, you get great things. So you like to speak there, or?
Yes, thank you, Eric.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'd like to first start off by thanking everyone for coming out to Part 2. God is so good. So let's tie some of the realistic realities of what goes on with the young people today. They're warehoused and labeled Heinz ketchup. We're going about it in an entirely unrealistic way. In this country, we've been known to want to get more bang out of our buck. This is what we need to do, and this is a recommendation. Some of these formerly incarcerated men and women who really have been through some trauma, we need to start training them, having them professionally trained by mentors. A mentor training program needs to be implemented so these previously incarcerated individuals can help these children navigate through all of this trauma and tragedy and abuse in a very realistic manner. See, we keep spending money on the less important things, and this is where we need to focus. We have Compton House. I see them housed in allegedly safe housing and running in packs. I see them trading in their food vouchers for marijuana. And then they'll tell someone else they're hungry. We are doing the best we can with the systems we have implemented, but we need to revisit this if we're really going to start saving these children and put them into our society as productive adults. I have 4 sons of my own, and my ex-husband was locked up for 10 years during their necessary, needed growth parenting period of a dad. So I'm used to being a mother and father, and the men and women that come in to Martin's place, I don't take no mess. I want them to understand, I'm helping you so you can help your children. And then your children can help their children. I have 23 grandchildren. Of course, I want them to be careful and cautious. But most of all, I want these people who we keep labeling to be part of a society that works instead of a system that does not. So please help me. I'm pleading with you to make everyone understand that we need these real mentors to mentor these recently incarcerated people so they can help these young people and we can stop warehousing them. Thank you. I love you.
I got it. So now we're going to move into the last 20 minutes of this discussion, and the first person I'm going to really start going Q&A with, but Frank, it's going to be you, is now constantly framing everything you've heard and understanding children. So what we've seen is how they are created neurobiologically in the environment. We've seen discussions back and forth about where people can end up and where the end result may be under certain risk. So now, Frank, being the director of Reentry at the Jersey City Employment and Training Program, where do you see most of these early childhood insults displaying, and how can people easily reach children or most create effective policies around that?
So I think when you examine what's influencing behavior in our youth, it's a lack of positive institutions, right? So we see more and more communities are left without funding, which can provide for positive social supports in our community, sort of doors that our children can walk into and receive sort of positive influence. And why that's so important is because, you know, the realities of the economic stress, other variables that take authority figures that can serve as a positive influence are removed. You have 2-parent households who are working more than one job, and children are left to their own devices, which means children are in the community more. Children are not supervised as much. There's not as much funding for after-school programming. There's not as much funding for sports activities. So what happens is children tend to build communities unsupervised, and they create norms and values amongst themselves. And then you get into adaptation. So adaptation, or healthy adaptation, doesn't speak to internalizing right and wrong or values that are right and wrong. It speaks to internalizing the values that will promote survival, acceptance with our youth, particularly our adolescents. And when these values are unhealthy or they're built amongst peers, teenagers, without sort of any supervision guiding it in a healthy direction, what's accepted as acceptable behavior is unhealthy behavior, or behavior that can increase the risk that they'll be in contact in a negative way with our criminal justice system.
Let me cut you off for one second, because I really want to focus on that term and really bring this to light to what we're seeing. So now you have Frank mentioned something about a healthy adaptation for a child in an unhealthy circumstance or environment. I would just like to ask a question actually of Dr. Forkey for 1 second, if I could. In your work, Dr. Forkey, up at UMass and working with the foster care evaluation services, what would some of these adaptations that may society have a narrative saying are not beneficial and healthy, but are almost needed to survive, what would they look like? What have you seen so people would understand what that narrative looks like in behavior?
So certainly what we see is the changes that will allow you to be able to fight off threats. So if you're in a situation where you're hanging out with people on the street and in gangs, your body gets upregulated and ready to fight. In fact, partially because of the changes in the brain, you become much more, we call it street smart sometimes, but it's that ability to look at a face and see if whether there's threat or not. That actually can lead to a very quick response by, because it's necessary in a situation where you may always be attacked. But if you take that and you try and put it into a classroom where a teacher says something or another child says something that's pretty innocuous, it may be interpreted as threat where none was intended. It also has to do with attention. You kind of can't keep your attention because you're always sort of hypervigilant, looking around, checking out where things are going. Certainly, there's actually a second response that the body can have. If you are under so much threat that there's nothing you can do about that threat, you have no ability to fight it. Sometimes this happens for kids who are disabled or for girls who are being constantly assaulted, like what we heard about as well. That actually tells the brain, fighting is not getting you anywhere, so the brain actually switches over to a dopamine response, and it shuts down. And those are girls who look like they're depressed, they draw into themselves because there's nothing they can do, and we misinterpret this as inattentive ADHD or depression. When we see it in babies, we say that they're developmentally delayed. In fact, what they're doing is they're doing what their bodies are supposed to do to protect them from these bad situations.
So oftentimes, and this is really for the whole panel, many times the interventions can be in choate if they don't involve parents. And as you were saying, Frank, oftentimes the parents may not be there. They may be in prison, they may be. Where have you seen interventions specifically for children where you get to build some of these interpersonal environments that allow them to start to regulate off that?
So I think what we're talking about is a substantial reason or cause for illness is the environment rather than the individual, right? The environment is promoting the illness. And to address that, you have to treat the environment as much as you have to treat the individual. So you have to. So recently, Jersey City Employment and Training opened Martin's Place, which is a reentry center, an employment center in the middle of a community that's in need of a positive institution, a door that somebody can walk into. So the power of Martin's Place is you don't have to be coming back from jail, right? Corrections is a reaction to behavior, but Martin's Place can serve as a more productive measure. Somebody who's sort of teetering, or somebody who's 17 years old and out of school, and maybe traditional academic development isn't the route that they're going to go. They can walk into Martin's Place and sort of tap into the trades, the unions, other avenues. I think it's about opening access to legitimate opportunity. And more than that, it's opening the idea that that access exists, because certain communities have an outlook that potential is limited, and the potential is limited because they don't have the same access to opportunity that other communities have. And it's about sort of widening that focus, right? And creating interventions that allow for people to realize their potential.
This question is specifically for Dr. Shores. Oftentimes when there's a model by Dr. Bruce Perry called the neurodevelopmental model of therapeutics, really looking where the age of insult happened in a child and trying to meet them at where they'd be able to communicate oftentimes, because children don't have access to language. And now thinking about your work and the interventions that you're doing, where have you seen interventions like yours and those that aren't so much based on language back and forth, which oftentimes may not be accessible to people with a constantly traumatized brain, but are more somatic and movement-based, things that can attune people, a child, to the caregiver?
Yeah. Well, actually, our intervention isn't very language-based, because the meditation that we do is silent meditation. And so even though we obviously have to do a little bit of discussion before setting it up, but really what people are doing is learning how to be comfortable with their own thoughts. And I think a lot of people that have had trauma throughout their life have spent a lot of time talking about it, talking about it and having other people tell them, like we heard earlier, that they're bad and that they're never going to make anything of themselves. And so, it is really an opportunity to listen to your own voice. What is your voice telling you about who you are? The exercise component, too, of course, is nonverbal, and I think it's also social. So it allows people to interact without necessarily talking. So I think those are really powerful ways to go about therapy. I think traditionally, psychologists have been very didactic or interactive in their therapies. Interacting, interpersonal therapy. You talk with somebody, or psychoanalysis, or CBT even. And I think there is a new movement, kind of to not necessarily away from those practices, but to integrate these more somatic exchanges. One of the things that I think is really important is that these women, we sit down and meditate with these women, as do the students from my laboratory and graduate students and what have you. And when all these women sit down on the floor in pillows, we're all the same. I mean, they've had really bad experiences in their lives, and they see us, we come in with our fancy little outfits and our education and our degrees, but they realize, when we all sit down on the pillow, we're all the same. We got all of us have these same kind of worries and problems, and I think that's helpful, that they're not different. They've had horrible experiences, but they're not inherently different than any of us.
So I want to address this to Reverend Watkins. Thinking about your 30 years working with children, oftentimes there's a big difference between people who talk about evidence-based therapy, but the key word is therapeutic. And when you deal with mental health workers throughout this state, and they're fantastic, whether they work for the Division of Youth and Family Services, the Children's System of Care, they are people that bring a heartfelt connection into all children's situations that are in this relative helplessness. What did you see in working with children that allowed you to break into that narrative while it's being written so early, that may not be discussed oftentimes in papers, but people can bring forward to reach across and maybe even have faith in what they're already doing to know that you've seen it work?
Well, I think that the most successful therapeutic attempts was actually an integrated system where the therapist was able to integrate both faith and the traditional therapy. And I think that the families, as well as the children, was responsive to that because it was non-prejudice. It wasn't a prejudice. It wasn't a religiosity type of approach, but it incorporated both faith as well as the traditional therapeutic approaches.
Ms. Muhammad, in your work, and I actually first found out about the work you're doing in the prisons. And there's been a tremendous link with women, addiction, and early abuse and childhood traumas. Did you see interventions work better even in the adult? So now we're looking at the book in its formation. Did you see how people related back and forth better to other things that may be more in accord to what we're talking about than the normal treatments of just speaking to somebody?
During the time in Hudson County, we did a lot of case conferencing, and we would discuss these women's issues in depth. And they were so severe in nature that the counselors, the Martins and the Lauras and the Candaces, they have to be counseled after counseling. Mm-hmm. So these women have had such traumatic issues. And I'm going to tell you something, and people aren't going to like it when they hear this. Like, the ethnic backgrounds of the women, specifically the women in jail, a lot of the Afro-American women will not relate and speak to me about their traumas because they feel embarrassed. Shame. 99% of the women who are incarcerated have told Martine, Kiefer, Laura, and Candace horrific tales. There's a 99% chance, because I'm Afro-American, that I know someone these women know, and they're embarrassed. So they will cling and welcome the opportunity to communicate with someone who they feel does not know anyone they know. So a lot of the women coming out of the Hudson County program, they're not taking some of that baggage back out into the street with
Well,
them.
that's an incredibly interesting point. I'm going to come right back to you. What we'll find out is oftentimes with all types of trauma, they're identity disintegrators. They start wiping across a cognitive, autobiographical identity, both psychological and physical, where you start losing track of yourself inside yourself. So you could start to see that many of the incarcerated have had this story set in time, never really having the language, as Frank and I talked about, due to the hierarchical brain shutdown. You wouldn't even be able to process what's happening to you, and then you can't offer it up for a multitude of reasons. But one of them is, and you hit the key word, one of them is shame, and we shouldn't leave that word today. I will. And where shame is very important is put shame on a continuum. It's shame, pride. And then think about the way that you define yourself and what you're willing to talk to somebody. And if you've been abused and your body can't even get on there, listen, people like the word addict. The last two presidents have come out and said, I've drank and I've used cocaine, and they got elected. Nobody comes out and says, I have schizophrenia and I was raped by my uncle. I mean, everyone, you know that society has started a discussion back and forth. And at one of the governor's recent events, the head of the NAACP said, everyone deserves a second chance, even those that weren't given a first one. So what we've seen now is a population of children that were denied even to be allowed to start. And the reason, as we're wrapping this up, that it's so important to me is I'm the child of a person who was a Vietnam veteran, had an MBA from Fordham, had a big house in East Brunswick, and who died homeless in Paterson, New Jersey, due to untreated PTSD. He went in and out of the prisons. He tried to murder me and my family. I am the child we're talking about. I live in that narrative, and my life's work, like everybody up here, is not just to reach across and help those that can't be helped. But I didn't end up in prisons. I ended up in a maximum security psychiatric hospital after my service in the military. They said I would die in. I know what it's like to be in New Jersey and feel like you're hated and disgusting and less than. I know what it's like to hate the only person that was supposed to love you. And I know what it's like to come from the restraints in this state, get an education, fight your way back, create a panel that ex-governors sit on, and stand in front of you with a panel full of experts and let you know absolutely anything is possible if we don't stop reaching out. So I'm going to wrap up this panel on that note, but I would like to thank everybody here, and I'd like to publicly say that this is in honor of my father, Arauz, who deserved this panel and this work, and his life may have been saved, and my family's life may have been different. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I'd just like to ask Heather, as you're thinking about this subject, what is it best that we could do?
I think the most important thing for the kids and the parents and the foster parents who are trying to care for these kids is to help them recognize that their bodies are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is the first step to starting to get past it and to learn that they can be safe and that their brains can function so that they can get through this safely. I'll point out to you guys before I go that there is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org, has huge resources for kids and for caregivers. So if you're looking for something for kids and families, that's something very practical. You can jump onto the internet and find that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for Heather?